Okay guys, today's the start of a tutorial which is probably more extensive than I've done before because there's quite a few components involved in it, and the concept is that we can add a CPT. I'm using MetaBox for this. We can add a CPT where we put events in a time zone, so we can put multiple events in multiple time zones and have those events display the correct time in the time zone of the viewer's browser. So here's an example here where we're putting on an event in Kuala Lumpur at 11 a.m. On the 11th of the 10th, 2024. There's an Australian format, so it's the 11th day of the 10th month, 2024. In Kuala Lumpur is when we're putting that on. So I want to know if I'm in Australia and I want to join this event, what time is that? And this is telling me that it's 1 p.m. on the 11th. So let's have a look at the time converter. So if I look at the Brisbane time, which is where I am, and I look at 1 p.m. 1 p.m. there, Kuala Lumpur is 11 a.m. Does that line up? It does. 1 p.m., 11 a.m. So the next one down, we're saying we're going to put an event on at 11 a.m. in Bangkok, which is 2 p.m. in our time. Let's double check that. Let's go to 2 p.m. in Brisbane. 2:30, no. So 2 p.m. Brisbane time is telling me that that's on in Bangkok at 11 a.m. up here. So let's check that. So 2 p.m. in Brisbane is 11 a.m. in Bangkok. So this is working as it should. The other thing is that it's ordering in the correct order. So because we're using multiple time zones, this date string cannot be the order, because the date string at a different time zone might be a different actual time. So UTC 0, so the reference time zone of UTC 0, it could be a different time in a different time zone. So what we want to do is convert that with that to UTC 0, so they're all referring to the same time zone, and then we're going to sort by that. So these are all calculated on UTC 0. In fact, we use UT 0 to calculate how we're going to display that and how we're going to display this as well. So in a nutshell, outputting this data is quite simple. These two fields here are basically a token, a bricks token, for outputting a meta field we've created in MetaBox. This one here is a bit trickier. We need to use JavaScript. The reason we need to use JavaScript is because we want it to display in the browser's time zone. If we convert that at a PHP level, the page gets cached, the time will be there correct for the first person who views it. The next person who views it is going to view the same time, but they're going to be in a different time zone. So caching creates problems, and we need to do that with JavaScript. The countdown, we're using a standard bricks countdown element, which has no facility for dynamic fields, so we need to do that programmatically in the background using PHP. So let's first take a look at how we create the CPT and what's important, and then we'll look at the structure in bricks as how we actually use this. All right, so let's look at one of the events. We've got an event here. We've got obviously the title, got a description. We have a drop down here, which is a select to drop down, so we can search in there and filter. And then we have an event picker, sorry, date picker with a date time. So we've got the date here and our time there, and it's in 24-hour format, sorry, 12-hour format, so we get the AM, PM. So it makes sense to us, right? And then we've got a read-only field, which would be hidden on production. This is just so we can test it and use it, which is automatically calculated on save of this. And it's based on UTC 0, which is a translation of this time zone and that date timestamp there into a UTC 0 string. And that happens with some PHP in the back end. And that's our reference point for all of the time zones going forward. Right. So that's how that's an event. The fields in MetaBox, and again, if you're using something like ACF or Toolkit or whatever you're using, it's maybe different for you, or will be different for you. I've got a basic text area for a description. I've got a time zone. I've used a ID of event time zone. And that time zone is using the select advanced field, which gives you the select to, so you got the search at the top. If you just select the basic select, you don't get the search facility, and there's quite a few of these in there, so I prefer to have that. Now, instead of putting in manual values in there, I'm calling a callback to get the values. And the function timezone identifiers list is a standard PHP function, which we could call here, but the problem we've got is that it returns an array of basically values. So the way MetaBox treats that is it thinks it's an indexed array, a numerical indexed array. So it gives us the drop down where the option has the time zone string and the value is the index. So it'd be 0, 1, 2, 3. So the stored value would be 0, 1, 2, 3, etc., which is not what we want. We want the actual time zone string. So we need to convert that into a associative array where the time zone is both the key and the value. So to do that, have a quick look over at WPCodeBox. I've got some debugging stuff here, which we'll go through later. There's my function there. We're not going to worry about any of this part. We'll talk about that later. The actual part that we're worried about is we're going to get our time zones using the standard PHP function. We're going to use this array combine, which basically combines keys and values into an array. And we're going to use the same keys and values that we got from up here and return that as associative array. So that little bit there is what makes it work in MetaBox. Okay. So that is that there. And then we just set a default. There's Australia, Sydney. And that's all we need to set for that particular field. The event date is a standard date time picker with the ID event date. The only things we change here is the date format. This is a jQuery date picker, so you can look at the jQuery options for this. And we want to set this into Australian format of day, month, year. The default is the American format, which is the other way around. And we want our time format to be hours and minutes. And this is a strange one here, this option here. The double T turns it into 12-hour format, so it gives us the AM or PM. And that's what changes this format here to give us the 11 AM, 11 PM, etc. And that's the date string there. So the day, month, year. All right, so that is those. And then we have one more to mention, and that is this UTC, or timestamp UTC. I'll put an underscore in front of it. It kind of indicates to me that it's either a private or calculated field. So we're not actually going to enter this or type this in. In production, I would make this a hidden field so we can see what's going on. Just making a text field and then just setting the read-only switched on so we can't change that field. We can only set it. So and what you'll see here, if I change that from Kuala Lumpur to something else, let's go Africa, somewhere in Africa. Here we go. And I hit the save. Watch this number here when I hit the save. Didn't change the date time string. I just hit update there. Okay, we've got a completely different number. That's because that is now a timestamp from UTC 0 based on that time zone with that time, date time string. Put this back to, I think it's Kuala Lumpur, so we can test it. Update that. And we're back to our time string. You can use an epoch converter, an online epoch converter to check these values, but I know it's working, so I don't need to. But if we now look at how that happens, so in WPCodeBox, we have a function down here. I'll stick this up on a gist. So this is my Event CPT functions. And all we're doing is on save of the post. If this is not an event post type, do nothing. If it is not, if it's saving a post revision or an autosave, do nothing. We're going to get we've got some utility functions further up here. Just gets the meta field for our date and our time zone from our event post. So we're just going to get those. If either doesn't exist, do nothing. So if there's something wrong where we haven't put a time zone in or a time string in, we can't calculate it, so do nothing. Okay. We've also got some logging here, which I'll talk about later. Now that we've got these values, we're going to do a try on this date time conversion. Now the reason we do a try is because the date time class throws errors or throws, what do they call them, exceptions. And we don't want to, basically, if there's a problem, we don't want to crash the site and come up with errors on the site. We just want to log an error. So what we're doing is using a try catch block for that purpose. So our date is a new date time, using our event date and our time zone from that post, from that event post. All right, we then set our time zone on that date object to UTC, and then we get our timestamp from that. So initially we set it using our events time zone, change the time zone to UTC, and then get the timestamp, and that does the conversion for us. And logging here again. The reason I'm using logging is because this happens in the back end, and then it returns a different HTML. So we can't just echo that out or var dump. We got to log that somewhere. All right, so once we get the conversion, we're just going to update the post meta. So that post meta ID with the UTC0 timestamp. And that was that one there. Or if we look at the field group, it's this here. All right, so that's pretty much all there is to that side of it. So that's all we need to do with the events. So the events, they make sense now. Now that this works, you can set that to a hidden field if you wish to. Okay. All right, moving on. We're now going to look at how we actually use this in Bricks. So I'm not going to go into structure here. If you're watching this video, you should know how to use Bricks. You should know how to create your own structures here. So I'm going to go straight to the query here. And that query is basically going to pull our events. We're going to use the order by metanumeric value, and we're going to get our timestamp UTC in ascending order. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world, it's going to be in the correct order when you view it in your time, regardless of what time zone the event is in. Okay, keeps everything in the right order. So that's the order I just decided to put it in. Now the other things here is we've basically got a basic text here, and I'm just using standard MetaBox tokens here to outpoint the event date and the event time zone. So these are the actual values that are stored in the event CPT. Okay, and that's just for reference. We then have this thing here with the 2 dashes. All we're doing is that's just another basic text. Let's put 2 dashes in there. Probably should be a span. We should make a wrapper for a P for all of that, but I'm not worried about that at this stage. Okay, so the only other thing we have to do on this one is we need to go to our attributes, and we need to create an attribute called data timestamp. I'm going to copy that string there and open that in Notepad. It's pretty hard to see in that little box there. There it is there. So we're going to echo, so using the Bricks echo function, I'm going to echo out this function here, which is get timestamp from string, and we're going to pass in the current iteration of the event date and event time zone. Okay, so that is whatever iteration we're on, 1, 2, 3 here. It's going to pass in the correct values for the timestamp string and the time zone to that function there. Okay, so let's have a look up the top here. Now, as always with Bricks, you have to whitelist those functions using this feedback here, the filter here. And here's our function here. And all we're going to do is call another utility class to get our date time zone. If it doesn't exist, this actually checks in PHP to make sure that it's a valid time zone. It's just going to log out a invalid time zone, and it's going to add this missing or invalid time zone. It's going to return that. So what we're going to get that instead. So if the time zone doesn't exist, that timestamp data value is going to say that it's missing or invalid. If it does exist, it's going to have a integer there, which would be our UTC0 timestamp. Okay, so what we then do is create a datetime object using our date string and time zone, and then just get the timestamp. Okay, and that will give us the UTC0 timestamp. Okay, that's that function there. The rest of this is just utility functions. It's just utility functions to get our values from our post. And the reason I've done this is, for example, here we're using MetaBox, but I'm not using the RWMB function, because if we debugging, for example, we disable MetaBox, then our site crashes because it's accessing a function that doesn't exist, which means we have to then test to see whether the function exists before calling it. Because these are simple values, MetaBox just stores them as standard meta values. We can just use the get post meta. We don't have to worry about whether MetaBox is enabled or not for that. Okay, so we can set this all up, and if we disabled MetaBox, it would still work. Actually, no, it wouldn't, because the Rix query loop requires it to happen, but it's not going to throw any errors or crash the site. Okay, so basically utility functions to get those existing. Okay, now the next bit here is we need to run some JavaScript to interpret that. Okay, so having a look at the JavaScript for that, it would be under this local time.js. I've just got here. So when the DOM content is loaded, we're going to create a function called convert Unix to local time date, the Unix timestamp. Now, there's a big difference between Unix timestamps and JavaScript timestamps, and that is that Unix is in seconds and JavaScript is in milliseconds. So we have to multiply that by 1000 to use it in JavaScript. Right, we set up an options object for our date function. To local string function. So you can set that however you like. I'm going to use enus as our base, and pass in our options there, and that's going to convert that into a local string. So when we set in a timestamp, it's going to output a locally formatted string. Okay. Now, what we're going to do down here is going to get all of the elements that have our data timestamp attribute. So remember over here, we put a data timestamp attribute on that basic text. So now what it does, it goes off and gets all of those elements. Then we're going to iterate through all of those elements. We're going to get our Unix timestamp from the dataset timestamp. So in JavaScript, when you've got a attribute which is data dash anything, you can access that through dataset dot and then whatever that name is, and it converts it into camel case. So if that was that timestamp day, then you would have to convert that into timestamp day like that. Okay, but we are not using that, so we're not going to worry there. So we're just getting our data timestamp, which is our UTC-0 timestamp, which was created through PHP. Okay. We're then going to get a formatted date by calling our function up here with the Unix timestamp from the data timestamp. So that will then go, okay, this is the UTC-0 time. I'm going to display this in my local time, which will take into account your UTC that's in your browser. Okay. And then we just basically set the inner text to the formatted date. So the inner text of that element then becomes, instead of the 2 dashes, it becomes the actual formatted date in your local time zone. So that's the JavaScript that does that. All right, this is taking a while, isn't it? Okay, so the next thing is our countdown. So what I mentioned previously is there is no dynamic fields in the countdown widget. It'd be great if there was dynamic date, dynamic time zone, but there isn't. So we have to deal with that differently. Okay, so how we do that is, if we look back at our code again, not our JavaScript code, at our bricks functions code here, we've got some code here. I'll put a reference in here to this code from Itchy Code. It's a great resource for all sorts of things. This is some time ago that he created this one. When was it? September 2022, indicating a filter for changing the settings of your bricks elements. And there's actually, to my good fortune, an example with the countdown timer. So he's basically saying here, there is no dynamic field for that. So what we need to do is change that using PHP. The example he's given here is var dumping out the settings, which you don't need to do, which I'll show you why. And here's the function that I copied and modified. So go for it. Again, I'll put all this up on a gist. You can then link to this and have a look at the original if you want to. So what we got here is when we call this filter here, it calls that, it looks for a ID, okay, an element ID of EWWNDV in this case. And if we look at the element, so the countdown element, that's the bricks ID that it's given to it. So if I copy that to the clipboard and go to my WPCodeBox, just go double click in there, just paste that in there. I'm just going to delete the BRXE stuff and the hatch, and that's the ID of that countdown widget. So if it's not the countdown widget, do nothing, just return the settings as they were. Then we're going to get and check our date time zone. So we're going to get the date time zone. If the time zone doesn't exist, do nothing, because we can't do anything with it if we don't have a time zone. All right, here's some logging here, which we'll talk about later if you wish to. We then get our event date. So we've got the time zone up here, we've got the date. We're going to create a new date time immutable object based on our when we want that to end and what the time zone is when that's going to end. We're then going to set the date field to our formatted date from that countdown object. Have a look again here. There's your formatted date there, but it doesn't look the same here as it does in the actual event. Let me actually look at it here and see what Bricks actually does with the. So we have a look at the widget here. That's the widget, and you can see Bricks puts the settings here under countdown options. It's got the date is in the format of 4-digit year, month, day, hours, minutes, seconds. So that's the format that we need to have. And for our time zone, it needs to be in the format of capital UTC plus or minus 0 padded 2-digit hours, 0 padded 2-digit minutes. That's the format we need for this to work. So what we do is come back to here and we say, okay, we need it in the 4-digit year, month, day, hours, minutes, seconds to match the settings for that element. Okay. Now I mentioned by looking in here, you can see that there's another one which is sorry, if you double click, you get all the escaped characters there. We want the time zone to match that format for our time zone on our event. So we come back to our WPCodeBox. What we're doing is getting the offset hours. So that's the whatever time zone we've created up here. Where are we? The time zone that we've created up here. We want to find out what that is. So the offset hours is going to tell us. By the way, this is a string that we put in there. So we're using it could be Australia, Sydney, Africa, whatever. What we need to know is what is the actual offset for that. So when you call get offset on this date time immutable or date time, it gives it to you in seconds, right? So to get it in hours, we're going to divide it by 60 and divide by 60 again. If it's a negative offset, then it's going to have a minus in front of it. If it's a positive offset, it won't have anything. So what we're doing is if it's greater than 0, we're going to set a symbol to plus. If it's not greater than 0, then set the symbol just to an empty string. Okay. Then we want to set our time zone to be UTC, then the symbol, and we're going to call a function here to convert this offset hours into 2-digit padded hour colon 2-digit padded minutes. Because that divided by, if we got that in seconds and we divide that, we might end up with 2.5, which is not 2.5. We want 202 colon 30 is the 2.5 hours. Okay, so we've got to convert it. So we've got a function that we call for that, which is a utility function up here somewhere. There it is. So decimal to hours. This utility function here takes in a decimal and converts it into a 0 padded 2-digit hours colon 0 padded 2-digit minutes. All right, so that is the settings that it returns for that element. So now this particular one has that date of 24/10/11 with a UTC +808:00. If we look at this one here down the bottom, it's a different one. If we look at that, that one there has a 24/10/15 with a UTC of +1100, and that's what makes that countdown work. So that is it. That is in a nutshell the way this code works. I'll share the gist. Again, it might be different for you if you don't use MetaBox, but it's pretty similar, and it shouldn't take too much to convert it into ACF or Toolkit or Pods or whatever you're using. All right. So at this point here, I'm going to say this is the end of the actual tutorial. And now I'm going to actually talk more about some of the code. So let's have a look at our WPCodeBox. I think when we looked at the JavaScript, that pretty much makes sense. We don't need to really talk about that. Okay. The bricks functions here, what we've got up here is when I'm doing simple stuff, I don't worry about the debugging. When I'm doing more complex stuff where this has got a lot of interactions, what I do is tend to put these functions here at the top of my script. And by the way, this is for testing. If you don't like the idea of leaving this in WPCodeBox, by all means, take it out of here, stick it into your child theme, and disable or delete from WPCodeBox. So this is a really good way of just developing your code. So what I do is I typically install Bugfoo as a plugin. And that gives me some easy debugging. Okay. At the moment, I've got debugging turned off, and I've set a log path here for my logs. So if I'm going to log anything to a file, I can use that. If I'm just going to log it out to the console, I can use the debug log. Okay. So all I'm doing is I create a function here called debug log, where I pass in an object and I pass in a context. And if my debug is set and Bugfoo is enabled. So what we're going to happen is if we've got this on true and we disable Bugfoo, then all of a sudden we end up with errors on the front end because this is trying to call a class that doesn't exist. So we check that they're both true. And then if it is, then we call the static method of log from Bugfoo, set out an array of our context and our object. Now down here, I'll give you an example down here of context and object. So basically we're calling debug log with our post ID and our function name. So this is going to log out WPE get event datetime timezone and then the ID. So we know that that has actually happened. Okay, we'll show you that in action shortly. So that's the debugging. And if we, for example, when we're saving the post data, we can't do it that way because it reloads the page after it's saved, or the content after it's paged. So we can't var dump, we can't console log because we're getting a different display, so that doesn't work. So we want to log it to a file. So what we're going to do is that if we've got debug WP to debug enabled, if it's not enabled, I should say, then do nothing. If it is enabled, then set our log path based on the constant we set up there. I'm just putting it on WP content log / WPCB-log.log. If the logs folder doesn't exist, then create it. And then we're just going to get a timestamp, MySQL timestamp. A formatted message will be our time, and then our message, then a PHP end of line, and then it's going to do a file put contents onto that. And I'm going to show you how this actually works. I'm just going to turn that true. Save that. All right, now if I go to my front end here and bring up Bugfoo, stick it on the side so we can see it a little bit better. Stick it there. So we've got the Bugfoo console is enabled. If I do a Control F5, we're going to see here a bunch of output from our Bugfoo console. So there's my context. That's my context, and that's my value. Okay. Then I've got a context of this function being called, and that was the value that was created. It was okay. Again, that does that twice. We've got this one here. where it calls that, and that's the value that was debugged. So that's my console logging using bugfoo. Now the other thing we'll do is have a look at this event here, and I'm going to hit save on that event. Actually change that. I might just change that to change the time zone there. Hit update. All right, and if I have a look at my log file here, I will see I've got a log with my MySQL date. I've got my message, which is convert, that and that. So that date time string at that time zone, and that's the UTC that was created from it. If we look at the actual WPCodeBox, and we see down here, I've got log file. I want the message to be convert, the event date, dot, with a dash dot is like a append in PHP, and the time zone. And then when it's successful down here, I want a log file timestamp UTC, and then the UTC timestamp, and that's what gave me this log here. Okay, that's very simple logging, but it is a very effective way of doing this when you're debugging in WPCodeBox. I'm going to set that back to false. And that was just a bit of a extra hint or tip at the end of this, because when you're dealing with callbacks and and filters and JavaScript and PHP functions, and then calling stuff from MetaBox for callbacks, and it's all related. So we end up with all these utility classes that are called, and it's all related to each other. But what we end up with is we can end up with some confusion. So having the debugging there really, really helps for this sort of thing. So I'm going to leave it there. It's a very long tutorial. I hope this makes sense. If you like this kind of thing, hit the subscribe, hit the like, and I will definitely put this up on a gist, which I'll link to. At least I'll put the code on the gist. I'm not going to do the bricks template because that'll be up to you to do. You can follow along with that, but I'll put this PHP code and the JavaScript code up on a gist so you can give you a starting point at least. All right, thanks for listening, guys.